On the morning of June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Jean Benjamin stood by the window of his concrete shelter, his gaze fixed on the coastline shrouded in a thick morning mist. The first rays of the rising sun began to dissipate the darkness of the night, but the world beyond the window remained silent and still, untouched by the coming storm. A light breeze stirred the sand on the beach, its soft rustling giving an odd sense of peace. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, and the lieutenant was in no rush. He had plenty of time. In his hands, he held his rifle barrel, carefully cleaning it as though it was the only important task at that moment. The meticulous motion of wiping and oiling the metal parts was a simple, calming action. In his pocket, there was a letter from his wife. She had written that she prayed for his safety and was waiting eagerly for his return home. As he held the envelope close to his chest, it felt like the only connection to the world he had left. It was a tangible link to a life that seemed increasingly distant, a life beyond the war that no longer felt like a reality he could reach. The letter, with its familiar handwriting, was the last thread of normalcy in a world that had become anything but. The officers and commanders had assured them the previous day that the defensive line along the Normandy coast was impregnable. Jean Benjamin, like all the soldiers under his command, believed these words without question. The defensive positions had been carefully prepared, fortifications constructed using the most advanced technology available. Huge concrete walls, fortified pillboxes, and artillery positions lined the coastline, presenting an image of a near-impossible barrier to any attacking force. He was convinced that no enemy could ever breach their defenses. His mind echoed the sentiment of every soldier in his unit. The preparation was sufficient, and victory would be theirs. The thought that the Allies could successfully attack seemed far-fetched, a possibility that appeared as distant as the ocean itself. Looking out into the foggy morning, Lieutenant Benjamin's thoughts turned to the horizon, where the faint outline of the coastline disappeared into the mist. No force will break through us. We will win, as we always do, he thought to himself. His conviction was unshakable. It felt as though the entire day ahead would pass in the same routine of preparation they had followed for weeks. Days filled with drills, patrols, and the steady march of time that would, surely, lead to another successful defense. As long as the fortress stood strong, the thought of failure never crossed his mind. In the trenches and bunkers, the other soldiers mirrored his certainty. They had trained relentlessly for this moment, had been conditioned to believe in the strength of their positions, and were confident that the Allies would not be able to succeed. Everything they had been told and had seen reinforced the belief that the German defenses along the Normandy coast were invincible. The weather, too, seemed to agree. The oppressive fog felt like nature itself was holding back any attempt to bring the battle to them. Even the wind, which had been eerily calm, seemed to be waiting in anticipation, as if the earth itself was holding its breath for what was about to come. Jean Benjamin couldn't help but feel that despite the tense atmosphere, the morning still held a sense of tranquility. Perhaps it was the familiarity of the routine that had made him feel secure. Perhaps it was the dull sense of invincibility that came from the confidence instilled by months of preparation. The soldiers had seen these defenses built up over time, and each stone laid, each turret added, each layer of concrete seemed to be a testament to the idea that nothing could defeat them. They were ready for anything. At least that was what they believed. In his mind, the thought of a successful Allied assault was nearly impossible. Even if they tried, the weather would hold them back, or the coastline would swallow them whole before they even reached the shore. Jean Benjamin believed that today, just like the many days before, would be a simple continuation of their routine, with no major disruptions. The events of the previous day, the brief moments of uncertainty caused by some intercepted intelligence reports, and the tightening of defenses now seemed like distant memories, easily forgotten. The day would unfold just as it always had, calm, collected, and victorious. But as the lieutenant gazed across the shore, something in the back of his mind tugged at him. The fog, still thick in the air, seemed to obscure his thoughts, as if trying to hide something from him. But he quickly shook it off. Nothing could break the wall of certainty that had built up inside him. The invasion, if it came at all, would be a fleeting event, a failed attempt to challenge the fortified stronghold they had built. As he finished cleaning his rifle, Jean Benjamin couldn't help but feel, deep down, that he was about to witness nothing more than the beginning of another day in the life of a soldier who stood firm in the face of an enemy he couldn't imagine would ever succeed. The defensive line along the Normandy coastline was truly formidable. Powerful concrete fortifications, large machine gun nests, and artillery positions, all surrounded by minefields, created the illusion of an impregnable fortress. Lieutenant Jean Benjamin and his platoon were assigned to guard a key section of this front, and every soldier was convinced that this area would be protected from any attack. For weeks, they had undergone routine drills and patrol duties, preparing for any possible threat. The soldiers firmly believed that preparation was all they needed for a successful defense. "We are ready. We won't give the enemy a single chance," Benjamin thought to himself as he stood confidently at his post, listening to the senior officers talk about the invincibility of their positions. In his mind, there was no doubt. Whatever enemy forces came their way, they would be able to handle them. However, in the past few days, intelligence reports had been coming in about the possibility of an Allied landing along the Normandy coast. But the High Command dismissed these reports, regarding them as part of anti-German propaganda. They convinced themselves that the chances of an actual attack were slim, and that their positions were impervious to any assault. Meanwhile, the senior officers reassured everyone that everything was under control. The weather was deteriorating, and the increasing number of worrying reports seemed exaggerated. No one expected that today would mark the beginning of one of the most monumental events of World War II. Despite these unsettling pieces of information, Lieutenant Benjamin continued to carry out his duties, oblivious to the scale of the threat that was about to unfold. The fortifications around them, which they had helped construct and maintain, were considered the epitome of military engineering. Concrete bunkers, reinforced steel, and carefully positioned artillery were designed to withstand any attack. For all intents and purposes, the defenders had created what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle for any potential invaders. Each day, the soldiers on the front lines went through their routines, confident that their position would hold, that their training would see them through. They had been conditioned to believe that no army, not even the might of the Allies, could breach such a well-prepared defense. For Benjamin, the certainty of their victory was almost instinctual. The soldiers had been drilled repeatedly, their weapons maintained with precision, their positions fortified and carefully mapped out. There had been no significant attacks in recent weeks, and the weather seemed to promise the kind of overcast skies that would make any assault less likely. These were the thoughts that filled Benjamin's mind, even as he stood vigilantly at his post, looking out over the coastline. The idea of failure seemed almost foreign to him. After all, they were German soldiers, the defenders of Fortress Europe, the ones who had withstood assaults from all sides for years. What could possibly go wrong? But deep down, beneath the surface of confidence, there was a subtle, quiet unease. He couldn't quite place it, but something about the reports, something about the growing number of aircraft sightings in the past few days, seemed different from the usual enemy movements. Still, Benjamin dismissed the feeling. There was no need to second-guess the judgment of those in charge, who had assured everyone that the weather would prevent any significant assault. As he thought back to his training, Benjamin recalled the stories of past engagements. The Allies had tried to break through before, at places like Dieppe, and had failed. What made this situation any different? They had prepared for months, they had constructed their defenses, and they had trained their soldiers. With all this, what could possibly break through their defenses? But as the days passed, the intensity of the intelligence reports about Allied activity increased, and yet the German High Command still refused to take them seriously. The invasion, they believed, was simply not possible, especially with the weather so unfavorable. Their optimism seemed unshakable, and this complacency spread among the ranks. There were no immediate signs of an imminent assault, so the soldiers continued their duties without much concern. Then, as the weather worsened and the fog thickened, a sense of stillness seemed to settle over the camp. It was the calm before the storm, the eerie quiet that preceded chaos. Benjamin couldn't help but feel a strange tension in the air, though he quickly brushed it aside. It wasn't long before the sound of distant explosions echoed faintly in the distance, a sound that, at first, seemed to belong to the usual artillery exercises that were often conducted on the coast. But as the hours passed and the rumbling grew louder, it became impossible to ignore. Something was happening, but Benjamin couldn't yet fathom the full scope of it. Despite everything, he continued his duties, following orders and maintaining vigilance. He couldn't have known, as he stood there in the shelter, that in just a few short hours, everything he had believed would be shattered by the overwhelming industrial might of the Allies. The reports, once dismissed, would soon become the harbingers of an invasion that was far more vast, far more coordinated, and far more devastating than anything the defenders had ever imagined. The defensive line, once thought to be unbreachable, was about to face an onslaught that would test every assumption the Germans had about the nature of warfare. On the morning of June 6, 1944, Lieutenant John Benjamin woke to an unusual silence that hung in the air. The stillness felt wrong, like a prelude to something monumental. He immediately switched on the radio, hoping to hear some word of the expected events. The first reports that came through were disorienting. They revealed that the Allied invasion had not yet begun. The weather continued to worsen, thickening fog covering everything around him. The air felt heavy, and the atmosphere was strange, almost suffocating in its silence. The coastline, which had always been a familiar, somewhat ordinary sight to him, now seemed eerily distant, shrouded in an unsettling quiet. Despite the worsening conditions, German command began to relax, assuming that the anticipated attack would not come on this particular day. As the morning passed, the tension that had been building over the past days began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of false relief. The prospect of a massive invasion seemed increasingly unlikely. The reports of Allied movements were dismissed as misinformation or exaggeration. With each passing hour, the anticipation of an attack faded, replaced by a sense of calm that seemed to settle over the front lines. As the hours ticked by, no one on the German side expected that this would be the day the Allies launched the largest amphibious assault in history. The soldiers continued their routines, patrolling and maintaining their posts. They went through the motions, unaware that the events they had been preparing for, the very ones that had seemed so distant and improbable, were about to unfold before them. The calm was shattered suddenly. At first, there were only a few isolated alarms, distant cries of warning from the sentries at the outermost posts. But as the signals of danger spread across the coastline, the unsettling realization began to settle in. Something was happening. The radios crackled with fragmented reports, first from one sector, then from another. The buzz of activity from the front grew louder, and the pace of communication quickened. Lieutenant Benjamin felt a strange unease as the reports became more frequent, more urgent. Something was approaching, but it was unlike anything he had ever anticipated. Benjamin sprang from his bed, the sudden rush of adrenaline making his heart race. He threw on his uniform and made his way outside, his mind still struggling to grasp the situation. The morning fog had not yet fully lifted, but the tension in the air was palpable. Soldiers scrambled to their posts, trying to make sense of the distant signals and increasingly urgent messages. The once sturdy confidence of the men began to crack, the certainty they had held about their invincibility fading with each passing minute. Lieutenant Benjamin hurried through the trenches, directing his men to reinforce the positions, to check the equipment, and to stay alert. But deep down, he could not shake the nagging sense that something much larger was unfolding. As he reached the edge of the fortifications, He stepped outside to the open air, looking out over the coastline. His gaze fell on the sea, and for a moment, his breath caught in his throat. What he saw was beyond comprehension. The ocean, once a barrier, was now covered in ships, hundreds, thousands of them, stretching as far as the eye could see. The sight was overwhelming. He had expected an invasion, but not this. This was no mere raid or skirmish. It was an armada, an unrelenting tide of military might heading directly toward them. The ships came in waves, endless in their numbers. Their dark silhouettes loomed in the distance, cutting through the mist like a tidal wave moving forward with unstoppable force. The enormity of it all paralyzed Benjamin for a moment. His mind tried to process what he was witnessing, but the sheer scale of the force before him left him speechless. The morning calm that had seemed so serene only moments before was now a distant memory, replaced by the thunderous approach of an invasion that no one had fully prepared for. As the first waves of the invasion force drew nearer, the full impact of the enemy's preparation began to sink in. Benjamin felt his confidence crumble. The once solid belief that their defenses could withstand any assault now felt like a fragile illusion. The ships, the planes, the endless stream of landing craft, all of it seemed to defy everything he had been taught to believe. The Allies, whom they had thought would struggle to coordinate such an attack, were not only prepared, but were carrying out their mission with frightening efficiency. The realization hit Benjamin like a blow to the chest. His mind raced with the impossible calculations. The sheer industrial capacity of the enemy had been underestimated. The resources that had gone into assembling this invasion force, thousands of ships, countless aircraft, and an overwhelming number of troops, were beyond anything that could have been imagined. The defenders had prepared for a battle, but they were facing an industrial juggernaut, a force capable of overwhelming their defenses not just with numbers, but with material strength. Benjamin felt a cold wave of fear wash over him. His training, his resolve, his belief in the invincibility of their positions, all of it seemed insignificant in the face of this impending storm. The overwhelming scale of the invasion was shattering everything he had once believed about the war, about the nature of their enemies, and about their chances of victory. In those first moments of realization, Lieutenant Benjamin understood something that no one had told him before. The war was not just a battle of soldiers and tactics. It was a contest of industrial might, and in that moment, it became painfully clear that the Germans had lost this battle long before the first soldiers stepped onto the beach. The Allies had come with overwhelming force, and no amount of concrete or steel would be enough to stop them now. As the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the beach, Lieutenant John Benjamin stepped out onto the sand, his boots sinking slightly into the soft surface. His eyes were drawn to the chaos unfolding before him. The vast fleet of Allied vessels had arrived, and now the massive landing craft were disgorging waves of soldiers onto the shore. It was nothing like he had ever imagined. The beach was suddenly a battleground, teeming with life and death, with soldiers moving in all directions under the cover of naval bombardment. The roar of the artillery, the crack of machine gun fire, and the heavy thudding of bombs exploding on the shoreline combined into a cacophony of destruction. German soldiers began firing at the advancing troops, but their resistance was futile. The bombardment from the naval guns had already softened the defenses, and now the enemy infantry was pushing forward relentlessly. Benjamin watched as the first waves of Allied forces rushed forward, some falling under the barrage of fire, others scrambling to advance, determined to reach the German lines. Yet the response from the German defenders, though fierce, seemed small in comparison to the overwhelming force pressing down on them. There was no time to regroup, no time to reinforce the positions. The assault was too swift, too coordinated, too massive. The sound of gunfire grew louder. The air was thick with smoke, and the beach was now a scene of utter confusion. The German defenders, despite their strength and resolve, were being torn apart by the force of the invasion. Benjamin could hear the screams of the wounded, the constant clash of metal against metal, and the cries of men who had lost their will to continue the fight. His heart raced as he looked around, trying to process what was happening. It was clear now. No matter how many defenses they had, no matter how many soldiers stood in the way, the Allies were too powerful, and their push forward could not be stopped. Benjamin's hands trembled as he gripped his rifle, staring in disbelief at the sheer scale of the assault. His mind raced with the grim realization that their carefully constructed defensive lines were nothing more than a temporary obstacle, already crumbling under the weight of the enemy's advance. What had seemed impenetrable hours ago was now falling apart before his eyes. The concrete bunkers that had once seemed so formidable were now being shredded by naval gunfire, their walls cracking and collapsing under the relentless barrage. The machine gun nests, which had been so vital to their defense, were falling silent as the soldiers manning them were either killed or overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemies pouring onto the beach. The beach itself had become a nightmare. The sand, once a quiet and peaceful expanse, was now soaked with the blood of the fallen. Dead bodies littered the ground, some lying still while others struggled to crawl for cover, only to be met by another round of enemy fire. The smell of smoke, salt water, and blood filled the air, and the scene felt like a surreal nightmare that Benjamin could hardly comprehend. His feet seemed to be rooted to the spot as he watched his comrades and their positions being wiped out. It was not just a battle anymore, it was a massacre. Benjamin felt the weight of the moment crash down on him. His confidence, which had been so firm just hours before, now felt fragile and hollow. It was as if the very foundation of his belief in their invincibility was crumbling. The stories, the assurances from his commanders that they were ready for anything, had all led to this moment of complete collapse. The strength of their defenses, the formidable walls, the fortified positions, they all seemed meaningless now. The Allies had come, and they had come with overwhelming power. They were not just attacking with soldiers, but with entire fleets, with an industrial capacity that was now on full display. As the morning wore on, Benjamin could feel his energy slipping away. The physical exhaustion of the battle, combined with the psychological toll of watching their defenses fall apart, left him numb. His thoughts were a blur. He could see the destruction, but he couldn't process it fully. The once pristine beach was now a battlefield, a testament to the industrial might of the enemy. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on their superior fighting capabilities, were now the ones being swept aside. It was a level of defeat that Benjamin had never imagined possible. The beach, once a strategic stronghold, was now a place of utter chaos. And yet, amidst the destruction, the enemy pressed on relentlessly. Benjamin's mind reeled as he realized that no amount of fortifications, no number of soldiers, could have withstood this kind of invasion. The Allies had come with more than just soldiers. They had brought everything they had, and they were using it all. The war, as he had known it, was no longer in their control. What had seemed like a battle of willpower had now become a brutal contest of industrial and military might. As the German defenses crumbled, Benjamin knew the battle was lost. His comrades fought on, but their spirits had been shattered. The sheer scale of the enemy's advance left no room for hope. Benjamin's resolve evaporated as he realized that the war was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight against an unstoppable force that was now sweeping across the beaches of Normandy, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. As the battle slowly began to fade, and the first signs of its conclusion appeared on the horizon, Lieutenant Jean Benjamin sat in his shelter, feeling the weight of exhaustion press down on him. His face was smeared with dirt, and his uniform was stained with the blood of both his comrades and enemies. Around him lay the lifeless bodies of his fellow soldiers, the remains of shattered fortifications, and the smoldering wreckage of destroyed tanks. The once imposing defenses, which had seemed so impregnable just hours earlier, now lay in ruins, offering no protection against the overwhelming force that had shattered them. It was hard for Benjamin to reconcile the scene before him with the certainty he had felt only hours ago. He had believed in their strength, in their preparedness. He had been sure that they would hold the line, that the mighty German defenses would stand firm against any assault. But now, in the aftermath of the invasion, it was clear that all their preparation, all their confidence, had been in vain. What he had witnessed that day was something entirely beyond anything he had imagined. The sheer power of the enemy, their industrial might, and the scale of the attack had left no room for hope. It had not been a battle of soldiers, but a battle of immense resources, and in that, they were utterly outmatched. Looking around at the devastation, Benjamin felt the crushing realization settle in his chest. The invincible defense that he had placed his faith in had crumbled under the weight of an unstoppable force. Their position, which had seemed so secure, had been obliterated by the overwhelming might of the Allied forces. The shelling, the constant waves of soldiers, and the relentless air bombardments had worn them down until there was nothing left to resist. Even the hardened positions they had built with the best technology available had not been enough to withstand the storm. Benjamin's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. What had seemed like a well-prepared defense now felt like a futile exercise. The strength of their guns, the fortifications they had poured their blood, sweat, and tears into, all seemed insignificant now. The German forces, known for their discipline and might, had been swept aside by a combination of superior numbers, resources, and technology. The realization that they had been defeated not by superior tactics or courage, but by the overwhelming industrial capacity of their enemies struck him hard. The noise of the battle had quieted, leaving only the eerie silence of a battlefield now filled with the remains of the fight. The initial confusion had given way to a somber understanding of their situation. The wreckage around him was not just physical, but psychological. The certainty that had driven them all, the belief that they could hold the line, that they were the stronger force, had been shattered. There would be no victory today, no heroic last stand. Instead, there was only defeat, the kind that left no room for escape, no way to reverse the course of events. As the morning light continued to stretch across the battlefield, Benjamin found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The futility of their resistance weighed heavily on him, and he felt a deep sense of loss, not just of his comrades, but of everything he had believed in. The war had changed in an instant, and the meaning of victory had been transformed. It was no longer about courage or strategy. It was about survival, about adapting to the overwhelming power of an enemy that was too well equipped to defeat. The defeat was not just military, it was philosophical. It was a shift in the very understanding of what war had become. The old notions of honor and valor, of winning battles through tactical superiority, were now obsolete. Instead, victory was about resources, about the industrial might that powered the machines of war. And in that regard, the Allies had already won before they even landed on the shores of Normandy. The fight was over long before the first soldier had set foot on the beach. As Benjamin sat there, the weight of the loss pressing down on him, he realized that his understanding of war would never be the same. It had been about more than just soldiers and strategies. It had been about the inexorable power of industry, of machines, and of logistics. The ability to sustain an effort, to pour endless resources into a conflict, had proven far more decisive than any amount of training or preparation. In that moment, Benjamin understood that victory could not always be achieved through force alone. Sometimes, it was the ability to adapt, to bend before the overwhelming tide that determined the outcome. The war, as he had known it, was no longer in their hands. The realization was sobering, and Benjamin could only sit there in the aftermath of the battle, surrounded by the wreckage of everything he had once believed in. What had been a symbol of strength, of impenetrable defense, had now become a symbol of defeat, of the limits of their power in the face of an industrial juggernaut. And with that, Benjamin understood that the war had irrevocably changed, and that he had changed with it.